Reasons to impose steep new tariffs on trading partners are many, from restoring American manufacturing jobs to reducing trade deficits with various countries. Trump and his administration believe that these tariffs will stimulate the U.S. economy. Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs mark one of the most extensive trade actions by the United States in decades. It has raised fears of upending the entire global trading order. Will it actually make America great again, as Trump has promised it will? Or will it actually hurt America and Americans further down the road? But first, a quick recap of these new U.S. tariffs that have kicked in. President Donald Trump detailed the tariff rates for key trading partners: 20% on the European Union, 10% on the United Kingdom. Remember, the UK runs a trade deficit with the United States. President Trump also explained the rationale that the U.S. would respond to China's 67% overall tariffs with a 34% duty on Chinese imports. And now China has responded as well, putting 34% reciprocal tariffs on American imports into China. 25% has been levied on South Korea, 26% on India. Among the highest were Vietnam and Cambodia at 46 and 49% respectively. Southeast Asian countries like Taiwan and Thailand, they were also at the receiving end of reciprocal tariffs, upwards of 30%. Even as world leaders expressed their shock and awe and the markets had a complete meltdown, both in the United States as well as around the world, the U.S. president has defended his move. These are the latest remarks from Donald Trump a couple of days after sending the entire trading world into a tailspin.
It's to be expected. This is a patient that was very sick. We really inherited a terrible economy, as you know, with a lot of problems, including loss of manufacturing and plants closed up all over the country. You know, we've lost 90,000 plants since NAFTA, if you think of that. 90,000, it's not even believable. And about 6 million jobs. And so it was a sick patient. It went through an operation on Liberation Day. And it's going to be a booming country. A very booming country. It's going to be amazing, actually. And we see it because we have trillions of dollars committed to come in.
So Trump announced that Chinese imports would face a 34% tariff. That's on top of a 20% retaliatory tariff, which he had already announced in the run-up to what he called Liberation Day. That brings the total tariff on Chinese imports into the U.S. at 54%. This aligns closely with the 60% tariff that he floated during his presidential campaign. In response, China's finance ministry has said it's also going to impose a reciprocal tariff on the United States, 34% tariff on all goods imported from the U.S. Into China starting the 10th of April. The impact of this was felt on the global markets as a whole, but more so on the American markets. The S&P futures have fallen 3.5% before the bell, while the Dow futures have also shed about 3.4%, falling below the 40,000 mark. The Nasdaq futures also tumbled close to 4%. So clearly the markets have been having a meltdown since Trump announced the reciprocal tariffs 2 days ago from the Rose Garden of the White House.
I'm going to put that in boldface type. This is a really big deal. These tariffs, these 34% tariffs on all American imports, are the fight back that China said it would do if pressured by the United States. These additional tariffs, because there are already tariffs of anywhere from 10 to 15% already in place, these tariffs will certainly hurt the American economy in the sense that they will really hurt the heartland of America, as in America's farmers. Right now, if we look at all of the products that China imports in from the United States, soybeans top the list. Soybeans are needed here in China because they are the ingredient that fuels the pork industry, which is one of the top commodities in this part of the world. So these additional tariffs are very strategic in the sense that they will hit farmers in the middle part of the United States. We're still waiting for the timing and the implementation of all of this, but this sends a very big statement. Also important in all of this is the timing of all of this. This is a very sacred holiday weekend right now. This is a time where families take time to remember those who have passed away. For the government to do this late on a Friday afternoon, early Friday evening here in Beijing really talks about the weight of all of this.
So the Asia-Pacific markets have also continued to plunge. The Japanese markets led the losses in Asia. The benchmark Nikkei 225 ended the day more than 2.5% lower. It was 4% lower yesterday. In mainland China, the CSI fell by about 0.6%, again, thereabouts yesterday too. The Hang Seng, though, has declined substantially, 1.52%. In Singapore, shares plummeted nearly 3% Friday to end the week in the red, extending a global sell-off. The Straits Times Index, which is a key benchmark for the Singapore Exchange, ended the session almost 2.95% lower compared to Thursday's close. And over in South Korea, the Kospi there pared losses to close 0.86% lower at the end of the trading day. India seems to have done relatively better compared to its Asian peers. The benchmark Nifty 50 dropped about 0.3%, while the broader BSE Sensex declined about 0.4% at the end of the day. It's similar to the losses on Thursday. So if you were to look at Asia, there are two markets which seem to have done relatively better compared to the others. One is India, certainly. The other, relatively speaking again, is China.
Well, the full force of what was announced showed up in markets today. Remember, last night was very, very dramatic for U.S. markets. The sharpest fall in the U.S. we've seen since, the depths of the COVID crisis. And the market here paid attention. The Nifty was down 1.5. The Nifty Bank, much better, relative outperformer in a big way. Mid-cap index down sharply, small cap the worst hit. And that's the way it turned out by 3:30. For the week, the Nifty is, by the way, down about 2.6%. This is Friday to Friday with a holiday, that is Monday, a holiday thrown in. Bank Nifty is unchanged, 0. So a big relative outperformer again for the week as well. Mid-cap index down 2, small cap index down about 2.6%. And of course, bulk of this damage came through on the last day today. Now, sectors, the two I want to point out, IT, clear loser, but again, damaged last 2 days, 9% gone. Metals, 7.5% gone, but bulk of the damage came in on Friday and some on Thursday as well. Large caps, and where there was pressure, very few stocks were up. I think I counted 3 names with gains of about 1%, but Tata Steel, Hindalco were the big losers that we had today. There was Vedanta from the metals pack outside the Nifty, which came under pressure. Oil fell sharply. ONGC was a big cut. There were auto names like Tata Motors, which were down sharply. Cipla, L&T were some of the other large caps which came under a fair bit of selling pressure.
All right, let's try and understand the global impact of these tariffs, because the last time we had these kind of sweeping tariffs on imports into the United States, you have to go back almost 100 years to the 1920s and 1930s. Ian Bremmer is the president of the Eurasia Group. Thank you very much, Mr. Bremmer, for speaking with us. You have called these Trump tariffs, these reciprocal tariffs, as the Brexit moment on a global scale, America's Brexit moment, if you will. Why do you think it's so bad? Because, the estimates of just how bad this is going to be, vary from 300 billion to 3 trillion. Why do you think this is comparable to Brexit or even the global financial crisis that we had in 2008?
Well, Brexit, of course, the UK still exists. It didn't undermine the political system. The economy still functions, just was a massive hit. It was a huge own goal. And that's what we're seeing here. Here, the United States is going to be charging its citizens a lot more for the privilege of existing in a less free market. The corporations are not going to perform as well. They'll be more constrained. They'll have less revenue opportunity. And you're going to see a long-term impact of de-risking away from the United States, the way we have seen global economies de-risk away from China over the past 20 years. Now, the restraint on that is that the United States, unlike the UK, is the most powerful country in the world, and there are some things you can't de-risk away from. You can't substitute easily away from a US alliance with military and security support. It's very hard to de-risk away and substitute away from US AI technology and the hyperscalers like Google and Meta and Microsoft. So it's not like everyone's suddenly going to say, forget about the United States. Of course not, or forget about the dollar. But this is a massive impact for a world that had gotten used to tariffs that were functionally near zero, and therefore very little sand in the gears of bringing goods and services and people across the world, crossing borders. That's not the world we're in anymore.
So how do you think countries are going to respond? What have we've seen in the last 24 plus hours since these tariffs came out is there are two kinds of responses. There are countries that are straight away imposing retaliatory tariffs back on the United States. China today has come out and said it's going to do a tit for tat 34% on US goods coming into China. And then you have countries like Japan, the UK, India to some extent, which are much more muted in their response, hoping to try and cut a deal with Trump. Which of these two sets of countries or which of these two sets of responses you reckon would be better off, let's say 3 months down the line or 6 months down the line?
There are three sets of responses. It's like Goldilocks and the three bears. It's too big, too small, and just right. And the Chinese immediately hit the United States with a full-on 34% reciprocal tariffs. There's an irony there, of course, because the Americans said that they were doing reciprocal tariffs, which weren't reciprocal. They were just focused on the trade deficit. And now the Chinese response is to make sure that the levels of tariffs on goods being imported and exported are actually going to be the same. Huge cost to both economies to doing that. The longer they stick with it, the worse it'll be. There'll be some countries that will capitulate. I see the Brazilians, the response to the 10% will be basically, let's try to do nothing because we don't want to antagonize the Americans. So there's no real deal to be had there. They're just trying to stay out of the headlines at a time when their economy is facing challenges. And then there'll be countries, the Mexicans, the Canadians, the Europeans, the Brits, who will try to talk, but they'll try to talk with a full recognition that if those talks don't work out, that there are going to be significant tariffs that will be placed in response, and there'll be hedging that'll happen as well. And so I think the in-between path is what countries that are of scale, that feel like they have trade competency and can get to a better place will try to do, but it's hard to thread that needle. And of course the markets are going to be on pins and needles over the coming weeks as they watch and try to suss out if whether or not other countries are going to be successful in engaging with the Americans and trying to reduce these historic announcements that you saw from the American president 2 days ago.
I want to go to a point that you made a little earlier. The Brexit example or the Britain example may not be comparable because the United States happens to be the biggest country in the world, the biggest economy, huge base of consumers and so on. And you said because of the security and military reasons, it's not possible to de-risk from the United States. But just on the economic argument, let's say, for India, about less than 20% of India's exports, its trade is with the United States. 80% of its trade is outside of the United States. Same's the case with China. China, sells about $300-400 billion to the US, but it sells trillions to the rest of the world. Do you reckon it's possible that, we could be moving in an America minus one sort of direction? The rest of the world is going to say, look, Trump has a problem with the existing trading order, but for the rest of us, it's working just fine.
Well, but it's not working just fine because, of course, when the world's largest economy and the world's second largest economy get involved in a trade war against each other, the costs of goods in a global market go up for everyone, and that is a problem for India. You're right that only a limited amount of that trade has direct impact on India, but the indirect implications are across the board. So, India benefits from globalization. India benefits from global stability and free access of markets. That's led to some extraordinary growth, albeit late compared to China. Nonetheless, India is clearly getting it right now, but this is a huge hit for the future of India. This is bad news. Now, I wrote, I think it was back in 2012, I wrote about what I thought was coming in the global order, a G0 world, not a G7, not a G20, but a world where the United States would be increasingly unwilling to lead multilateral institutions, collective security, free trade, promotion of democracy, rule of law, and that no other country or group of countries would be willing and capable to take the place of the United States. And that is where we are right now. That is a world of far greater cost, of far greater volatility, of much greater danger. And it's going to take a long time to get through this G0, through this geopolitical recession, into something that feels more stable.
It's interesting you say that. You don't think China is willing and ready to take that mantle? To lead
Not at all.
the global order, as it were?
Not at all. Not at all. China, of course, is a much smaller economy than the United States. Militarily, China is a regional power. It is not a global power, not at all. China's economy is in a lot of trouble, and they're trying to focus much more on domestic consumption and on domestic manufacturing. Now, there's no question that as the Americans shut down USAID, you just saw with Myanmar, there was a massive earthquake and thousands of people perished, and the Americans were virtually nowhere to be seen, and the Chinese were doing more than they had done historically. But you wouldn't call that a global leadership role. You're very, very far from that.
So I want to sort of flip the argument and just look at it from the Trump, MAGA, Lutnick and Greer sort of point of view. And that is, they've been consistently saying that, look, the rest of the world is not playing by the same rules. They're ripping America off. Manufacturing towns, which were once prosperous in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, have now been completely hollowed out because these countries are manufacturing those goods at cheaper rates. And it's not like they're allowing American products to be sold in those markets by imposing, monetary and non-monetary tariff barriers. Is there any merit in that argument at all?
Well, there are two different types of arguments here. One argument is that tariffs should be reciprocal. They should be, we'd like them lower, but we're okay with them higher because other countries are putting higher tariffs on the U.S. than the U.S. puts on them. That's a reasonable argument, although there are a lot of economists that really don't like it because of competitive advantage in different good sets. But nonetheless, and keep in mind, the U.S. is the wealthiest country, large economy in the world. So the U.S. has done very well on the back of the system. You're hitting a lot of much poorer countries. So, on its face, it's very hard to say, oh, poor America. You can say a lot of people in America haven't done well because the U.S. hasn't redistributed its wealth internally because wealthy people don't care as much about poorer Americans. But that's a domestic problem. That's not a global problem. But what the U.S. did in terms of its tariffs was not reciprocity. What the U.S. did was say, let's look at every country where there is a trade deficit and let's put a tariff on them that would lead to parity. And of course, what that meant is that the U.S. level of tariff is far higher on these economies. So, you look at these incredibly poor countries like Bangladesh and sub-Saharan African countries that run trade surpluses with the U.S. because their people can't afford American goods. And the Americans want to buy, textiles and commodities that are really cheap. And now the Americans are going to put 50, 60, 70, 90% tariffs on those countries because they're poor? Like that doesn't make sense. And then the Americans put 10% tariffs on every other country, including tariffs where the Americans were already running a trade surplus. So the argument that you are making does not actually fail. It fails on its merits because that's not what Trump actually did. Now the speech he gave is consistent with what you just said, but the speech he gave is a lie. The speech he gave does not actually reflect the way he put tariffs on those countries. And maybe he just doesn't understand that because he's not an economist. Neither am I, but I can at least read economics and I talk to economists. But that's a challenge, right? Then the other question, which is a broader question, is look, if you're the United States and you decide that you just don't care about non-Americans, that the idea that other countries have cheaper labor than the United States, and so your corporation should be able to produce and take advantage of cheaper labor, which over 50 years has led to the emergence of a global middle class. Well, the Americans are saying we don't care about those people. We care about Americans. That's it. And so no more of this American leadership to rise all boats. It's going to be the U.S. is the most powerful country, and we're going to make sure that we take care of American citizens. And it doesn't matter if other countries get hit. And it doesn't matter if other countries don't have an opportunity, whether it is because the Americans industrialized first and no one's going to pay to help them deal with a climate change world in India or in Indonesia, or no one's going to pay to help them continue to globalize. That is it's kind of like a tough luck sort of argument. That argument is, I think, more aligned with where MAGA is today.
But even on that,
appealing
if I may, Mr. Bremmer, the problem with that is, okay, I get the logic of, okay, Trump wants Apple and Nike and Ralph Lauren and all of these quintessential American companies to start manufacturing in America again, right?
Yeah.
That's the end game here. That's what he's trying and hoping for. The problem is, you can't set up a factory tomorrow or the next week or in the next 3 months. It takes probably at the very least a few years to set up a factory.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
Now,
Right.
the point is, are Americans prepared for that pain? Are American companies prepared for that pain in that interim?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, on the one hand, the Americans have historically been some of the most short-term oriented people in the world. We're consumers. We want it now. Give me, sort of 100 different types of breakfast cereal that we can buy at any moment, and you put advertisements everywhere, right? It's very, very, click-driven, market-driven, consumption-driven, reptile brain country, right? So in that regard, you'd expect that the Americans are going to be very angry. But, Liberation Day was April 2nd. And there was a reason it was April 2nd, and that's because the elections in Florida and Wisconsin happened the day before. Because Trump knew that people weren't going to like this. But, I think Trump's willingness to say, I don't care if people are unhappy, they're going to have to deal. Because he's 78 years old. He was almost killed a few months ago, shot in the head, right? I mean, this close. He realizes he doesn't have much time, and he's trying to do as much as quickly as possible. And he's not listening to his advisors. He's incredibly confident, and he's saying, I'm going to do all of this. And if you don't like it, tough. And if the markets respond badly, tough. Now, does he really believe that 100%? No, but a lot more than he did in his first term. So, and keep in mind, the Democrats are absolutely nowhere right now.
Yeah.
Their approval ratings are in the toilet. They have no leadership. They have no policies that Americans support. So it's not like there's any domestic opposition to Trump that's creating an alternative to the damage that he's doing to the U.S. and the world.
So just very quickly, so game this out for us the next 6 months as best as you can. So you're going to see a lot of stock market turmoil, a lot of American companies, the biggest poster boys of American capitalism, Apple and Amazon, and all of these companies are going to lose a lot of value. American consumers are going to have to pay for a lot of these products in the interim. How does this all play out for Trump? Because Trump also has a threshold. What may that be? I mean, you reckon he will game this out for the next 2 years till the midterms, and then count the political cost, or he's saying this is it. I'm going all in on this.
Well, you just gave me two different time frames, 6 months and 2 years. Those are two very different things. 6 months is easier. I think he can game it out for 6 months, and I think he also will want to pocket some wins. There are a lot of countries out there that don't want to experience the pain. That are going to get hit very, very hard. The Canadians are going to get hit very, very hard. It's going to hurt them a lot more than it'll hurt the Americans. The Mexicans are going to get hurt much more than hurt the Americans. Those countries are much more reliant on the United States. I think that Trump will look to pocket deals with those countries that will eventually create a new USMCA, Mexico-Canada agreement. So first, he'll want to get some wins, and he'll want to show that me being a tough guy leads other countries that are weaker to capitulate. And you saw like Panama is like, okay, let's find a way to get out of Belt and Road, and let's find a way to sell these ports off to an American company. There'll be deals like that he'll pocket, but there are also going to be major costs. Now, you mentioned, the Amazons, the Googles. I'm not sure those are the companies that are going to take it the hardest, because, you don't have good substitution effects for the American hyperscalers. These are the commanding heights of the American economy, the global economy, and there's nobody that can do what they can at scale. I'm more worried about the American manufacturers. I'm more worried about, sort of the automotive companies. I'm worried about the big companies that actually need to source their products, their chemicals, their inputs from around the world that aren't as efficient and that do have substitute effects in other countries. And I think those companies are going to be hurt quite a bit. And I think consumers are going to get hurt too, because inflation is going to be high, their growth is going to be low, and all of these people that are in the stock market with their pensions are going to watch their pensions take a huge hit, and they're not going to be happy. Look, Americans voted for this. They voted for taking illegal immigrants out of the economy, which means higher inflation, it means lower growth, and they also voted for tariffs and for focusing more on bringing jobs home. And all those things are going to have a major economic cost. We'll see how the Americans handle it.
All right, and one final word before we let you go. From the Indian point of view, there are two sort of schools of thought. One is the optimistic school of thought, and they're saying, look, there's a silver lining here. The products that India exports to the United States, we are being tariffed currently with these reciprocal tariffs at 26%, and you look at Vietnam at 40 whatever percent, and Bangladesh at 37%, and China at 54 effectively. So here's an opportunity for India to use this differential to export more to the United States. There's also the view that, look, the two countries are engaged in negotiations for a bilateral trade agreement, and they've publicly said, both leaders, that they're hoping to conclude that by the fall, when Trump is going to be here in India for the Quad Summit. So this is a short-term pain for the next 6 months. Which of these views you reckon could likely play out?
I think it's going to be longer term because I think that the reputational power that the Americans have had in leading multilateralism and the institutions and architecture around that is meaningful and strategic and is now being eroded permanently. So I think there'll be a cost to that, and India, as a key component of the global economy, will face that cost. You are correct that India is not being hit as hard as a lot of other countries. And I mean, from a relational perspective, if you get hit in the face, but the other guy got hit in the face and is knocked out, I guess you feel pretty good about that. But I think you'd rather not be hit in the face. And I think, if you're being objective about this, India would rather not be hit in the face.
All right, Ian Bremmer, as always, a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining us and explaining the reciprocal tariffs and what might be the likely fallout of it over the next few weeks and months. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Brass Tacks.
Yep.
So U.S. President Donald Trump, his tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs, have roiled global markets. They've shocked world leaders. But how did Trump and his team decide on which country will face how much tariff? Now, the method for calculating the tariffs was largely unknown before Trump made the announcement a couple of days ago. The administration had initially said that the tariffs would be based on both direct and indirect trade barriers, including non-tariff measures like taxes and currency policy. But the actual formula that was used to arrive at how much each country would be tariffed at, that was very different from what the White House had originally suggested. Now, added to the confusion, some tariff rates mentioned by Trump differed slightly from those in the official document accompanying his executive order. So the calculated manner in which these reciprocal tariffs mainly came through was on trade imbalances, on trade deficits really, rather than actually matching the tariff rates with individual products or other trade barriers that were set by different countries. So in that sense, it's not really a reciprocal tariff, it's actually a derivative of how much trade deficit each of these countries, or trade surplus I must say, each of these countries runs up with the United States. In fact, when this calculation was questioned on social media platforms, the White House responded with a formula featuring Greek letters and 6 research references to underscore what it felt was the credibility of this momentous economic decision. But it was exactly what was pointed out by economists that, look, what they've essentially done is a hack job. Taken the deficit, divided that by the total imports from that particular country, arrived at the figure for the tariff. Essentially, this is the math. Take the U.S. goods trade deficit with any country, China, India, Indonesia, divide that by the country's exports to the United States, and then turn that into a percentage figure. Then, as Trump, the deal maker, famously said in that Rose Garden speech, he is offering a discounted reciprocal tariff of half of that rate. So cut that figure in half and produce what is called the reciprocal tariff by the Trump administration on each of these countries. Now, countries where the US had a trade surplus were not exempt either. So this whole idea of the reciprocal tariff was to put up a tax on those countries which were ripping America off, which were selling much more to the United States and buying far less from the US. He's imposed this on countries which run a trade deficit with the US as well, meaning the Americans sell much more to these countries than they sell back to the United States. They were hit with a flat 10% rate, as were nations where the trade was balanced.
If you look at that, China, first row, China, 67%. That's tariffs charged to the USA, including currency manipulation and trade barriers. So 67%, so we're going to be charging a discounted reciprocal tariff of 34%. I think, in other words, they charge us, we charge them less. So how can anybody be upset? They will be, because we never charged anybody anything, but now we're going to charge.
So let me give you three concrete examples to try and put this into further perspective. China had a trade surplus of almost $300 billion, to be precise, $295 billion with the United States in the year 2024. It exported $438 billion of Chinese products into the United States. So that gives you a ratio of about 67-68%. When divided by half, which is what you heard from Trump a moment ago, they're giving the Chinese a discounted tariff rate. The final tariff rate becomes 34%. In the case of the European Union, the US trade deficit was $235 billion in 2024. Divide that by the bloc's exports to the United States, which totaled over $600 billion. The result is you get a 39% sort of tariff, which then is halved by the Trump team to make it 20% on the European Union. The White House's figure is calculated at more than 10 times higher than the actual average weighted trade tariff that is charged by the European Union on American products, which is 2.7%. So they've basically increased that by 10 times because the calculation is based on deficit, not so much the actual tariff of what product is being imported. Now, India, which currently is negotiating a bilateral trade deal and is hoping for some concessions as and when that is finalized, India has been taxed at 26% by the United States. India's imports stood at India's exports to the US, I must say, stood at $87 billion, while the trade deficit was $45 billion. So you divide 45 by 87, that gives you a ratio of 52%, and then you halve that, the final tariff is 26%. So no one has been hit harder by these new reciprocal tariffs than some of the world's poorest countries. Many of them happen to be in Africa, happen to be in the Pacific Islands. It has blindsided some of the world's tiniest countries because of a formula which is completely flawed. So, Trump administration announced a 49% tariff for Cambodia, which imported goods worth $320 million from the US. The US, on the other hand, imported goods worth $12 billion from Cambodia. Cambodia sends around 40% of its total exports to the US, including apparel, footwear, travel items, etc. Laos, that's a country of just 7.5 million people. The landlocked country is one of the poorest and least developed countries in the entire Asia Pacific. It suffers from massive public debt and high inflation. There are budget cuts and currency depreciation as well. But the Trump administration has seen it fit to levy a 48% tariff on Laos. In Myanmar, where just a few days ago we saw the devastating earthquake, it left more than 3,000 people dead, the Trump administration has imposed a 45% duty. America is one of Bangladesh's major markets for ready-made garments. It now faces a 37% tariff, and experts say these tariffs could hurt Bangladesh's market share of textiles in America, which is around 6%. Lesotho, which is a country in southern Africa. It is a poor country. It was slapped with a tariff of 50%. It imports just $2.8 million of American goods because it's a poor country. Consumers there cannot afford to import too much of US goods. This created a big trade surplus because the exports to the US, mainly diamonds from Lesotho and textiles, total up to $237 million. So the new tariff that could hit Lesotho's textile sector, which is a main source of employment. The East African country of Madagascar, which exports vanilla and metals and apparel to the US, faces a steep tariff of 47%. Again, one of the poorest nations in the world with a GDP per head of just $500. In 2024, it exported $700 million worth of goods to the US. The world's third smallest country of Nauru saw a 30% tariff from the US government. It's a Pacific Island country. Many may not even have heard of Nauru, leave alone pointed out on a map. So it's not just small and poor countries. Trump has targeted some of the traditional allies of the United States, Australia, some remote uninhabited islands in the Antarctic, And a territory which is so tiny with barely any exports is also on Trump's list. According to the government data, the U.S. has recorded trade deficits with the Norfolk Islands for the past 3 years, but this sweeping tariff regime has left locals and analysts there completely baffled.
Among the economies hit by US President Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs announced on Wednesday, some remote Australian islands that are home to penguins, but not people, and a tiny outpost 600 miles off any exports. The hefty tariff has baffled and amused its 2,000-odd locals, as well as Prime Minister Anthony Albanese.
Norfolk Island, interestingly, is I think 29%. I'm not sure what Norfolk Island major exports are to the United States and why it's been singled out, but it has.
Albanese said Australia fared better than most other countries with a tariff of just 10%, but yet a higher figure. US government data did show some trade deficits recorded. In 2024, the island exported $200,000 worth of goods to the US and imported $100,000. The volcanic island ships some palm seeds abroad, typically worth less than $1 million a year, and mostly to Europe. Adding to the confusion, another Australian territory was on Trump's hit list, the Heard and McDonald Islands in the Antarctic. It has a population of 0 humans. But as of Thursday, they faced a 10% tariff for exports to the US.
So the person who discovered this formula of how the reciprocal tariffs were arrived at is James Surowiecki. He's a financial journalist. He in fact put it out there on X, the social media platform, this whole methodology behind the Trump reciprocal tariff calculation. Thank you very much, James, for speaking with us here on CNN News 18. You certainly got a lot of name and the basis of which the Trump administration has put these reciprocal tariffs. How did you figure it out?
Well, I think the way it worked was when we first saw the chart of these supposed tariff rates, they're not even really reciprocal tariff rates. That, in fact, is sort of a misnomer because they're not actually based on tariff rates that countries are charging at all. But when we first saw the chart, the numbers just looked very strange. So some countries just had tariff rates that seem much higher than in reality. I mean, an example would be Vietnam at 90%, or this little African country that's gotten a lot of attention recently called Lesotho. It was listed as having a tariff rate of 99%. And then conversely, there were some countries that we know have relatively high tariff rates and trade barriers, like Brazil, that had a relatively low tariff rate on the chart, like 10%. So it was clear that something weird was going on. And I actually originally thought they had just kind of made up the numbers, because what they had said was that the numbers reflected actual tariffs plus what they're calling non-tariff trade barriers. So I thought which gave them a lot of room to kind of fudge the numbers. So I thought they had just done that. But then that didn't explain certain things like Brazil or the UK at 10% or whatever. So then I just started messing around with the numbers. Was it imports divided by total trade? Was it the trade deficit as some kind of percentage? And there weren't really that many options. And then I just hit on this idea that it was the trade deficit our trade deficit, the United States' trade deficit with a country, divided by our imports from that country. And I actually only checked like 2 or 3 countries, but it worked, and it just I was sure at that point that was right.
I mean, there was also all of this Greek formula and the Greek alphabets and the signages that was written by the USTR. Did you see that post, and what did you make of that?
Yeah, that actually, I'm not exactly sure when that went up. I think that might have gone up after, not necessarily after like my tweet, or other people had talked about this as well, but I didn't see it until the deputy White House press secretary retweeted my tweet and said that no, they had literally calculated the tariffs and the tariff rates by looking at tariffs and non-tariff trade barriers. And he included a screenshot And then he said they used this formula. He included a screenshot of the formula, and which had, as you said, these kind of Greek symbols in it, as a lot of economics formulas do. But when you actually looked at the formula and figured out what it said, what it basically boiled down to was imports divided by trade deficit divided by imports. So it basically was, okay, yes, this is what they did. So but, yeah, that's how it works.
You know, the interesting thing, James, with the whole manner in which they've arrived at this formula, like you said a moment ago, it has actually nothing to do with reciprocal tariffs. It's not like they're saying, and Trump famously kept saying this in the run-up to this Liberation Day, we're going to tariff them how much they tariff us. We're going to charge them how much they charge us. This has nothing to do with any of that. This is deficits by total imports, as you said.
That's exactly right. What it's really a measure of is, basically it's a measure of how big and important our trade deficit with a country is to the U.S. Right? It's a measure of that, and it's basically predicated on the idea. There are two important things about it, I think, from a policy point of view. The first thing is that it is predicated on the idea that if the United States has a trade deficit with a country, that trade deficit is the result of trade barriers or tariffs or some kind of bad behavior or whatever, interfering behavior on the part of the other country. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that's true. Obviously, India obviously had very high tariffs for a very long time, and China obviously made it very difficult at points for you to export anything to them. So sometimes that is the case, but a lot of times it's not the case at all. Like Lesotho, that little African country I mentioned, we run a huge trade deficit with them, which is why they have this tariff rate of 99% supposedly. But that's because they export diamonds, which we can afford and buy, and they're a relatively poor country that isn't really in a position to buy much from the United States, and that honestly I think American companies are not like anxious to sell to. So in that case, the tariffs have nothing to do with it. So yeah, you're exactly right. They're not reciprocal tariffs, and they have nothing to do with whether a country has trade barriers or not. As I said, there are some countries that have high trade barriers that we still run surpluses with or have very small deficits with because they don't buy much from us. Because we don't buy much from them. Then the other thing that's really important about it is that if you think about how countries might respond to this and how the U.S. might, change these rates or whatever, it's not simple, because if in fact a country had a tariff rate of 90%, then it could just say, all right, you know what, we'll cut the tariff rate. But that's not the problem for Trump. The problem is not that Vietnam has a very high tariff rate. It's that Vietnam doesn't buy enough stuff from us and sells us too much stuff. That's a much harder problem to solve. And so I don't think this is going to lend itself to easy negotiation.
So again, the fundamental principle with this whole reciprocal tariff, it would make sense if countries are buying and selling the exact same thing. Right, when you had the barter system thousands of years ago, but it makes no sense because countries are not buying and selling the exact same thing. In the case of India, for example, he's made it a universal sort of tariff at 26%, but there are things here in India, agricultural products, dairy products, milk and eggs and so on and so forth, which are charged at higher than 26%, sometimes up to 50%. Right, there is whiskey and other things which are charged at 100%. Now, the problem with the reciprocal tariffs is that in some instances, because it doesn't mirror products and the reciprocity of those products, the tariffs of those products, sometimes, in some instances, in the case of dairy products in India, he's actually reducing the tariffs. He's not matching tariff for tariff. So it makes no sense.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, if you really wanted to do this, if Trump really wanted to do it in a way that was rigorous, yes, he would go product by product or product line by product, which is sort of how it's done when you negotiate, say, a free trade agreement like the one we have with Canada and Mexico. Although, of course, Trump has now imposed new tariffs on Canada and Mexico. But yeah, instead he's doing this very flat across the board tariff that is, again, kind of not really connected to trade barriers at all. It's really just connected to the trade deficit. And to pick up on what you said, it actually, for American consumers, it's especially bad because what it means in some cases is that we are imposing high tariffs on imports of goods that we don't and can't make ourselves. So a great example would be coffee. So we are imposing, according to Trump, a 32% tariff on all imports from Indonesia. So Indonesia, Sumatra makes great coffee. I drink it. So there's going to be a 32% tariff on Sumatran coffee. We don't make coffee in the United States, with the exception of Hawaii, which grows a very small amount of it. We don't make it. So it's not going to encourage anybody to switch from Indonesian coffee to American coffee. So it's not going to accomplish any of the goals that they say they want to accomplish in terms of like bringing production back to the United States, or the same is true of like bananas from Honduras. It's just a very, it's a kind of obviously unilateral way of doing things. And it's also just a very ham-fisted way of doing things.
And one final word before we let you go. Again, it would make sense in principle if it's applied on those countries which run up a massive trade surplus with the United States. But like you said, he's imposed this on countries that have a deficit with the United States, the UK being a classic example. The UK has a deficit with the US. Brazil has a deficit with the US. So the point is, how does Trump explain putting 10% on the UK despite the fact that the UK does not have a surplus of trade going into America?
I think the only explanation for it is that when Trump was campaigning, he said, we're going to put a 10% tariff, just kind of like a flat 10% tariff on the whole world. And he got it in his head that was a good idea. He actually used this phrase like, it was like a ring around the United States, like kind of like a wall, basically. So yeah, you're right. I mean, as I said, Brazil, we run a small surplus with Brazil. We run a surplus with the UK, and those countries also got slapped with the lowest rate, which was 10%. I think part of it is just that he has this idea that we want to kind of protect ourselves. I also think, to be honest, Trump just loves tariffs. He always has. It's one of the few things that he's been consistent about in his life, and he's been talking about it for almost 40 years. And I think he really wants to make sure he's desperate for the U.S. not to get ripped off. He's always worried that we're getting ripped off. And I think the 10% tariff is just like his way of being like, that's table stakes. We're going to put this down, and maybe we can negotiate it away, but it's definitely there.
All right.
Can I say one other thing? One thing that's worth noting about these tariffs and about the way they were calculated is that when they were calculating the trade deficits and the imports, they only looked at goods. So services, where the U.S. actually has a massive surplus with the world, were totally excluded. So it's a very calculated in such a way as to make it very easy for the United States to impose these really big tariffs, which again fits with Trump's general view of the world.
All right, James Surowiecki, many thanks for joining us here on Brass Tacks. Thank you. China held military exercises around Taiwan for 2 days running this week on Tuesday and Wednesday, sending warships and fighter planes very close to the island. China says this was in response to Taiwan's president Lai Ching-te after he called China a foreign hostile force. China responded by calling President Lai a parasite. The 2-day exercises focused on the Chinese military's ability to control and seal off both the seas as well as skies around Taiwan. This happened on the eastern and southern side of the Taiwan island, from where it is harder for China to attack. It is also from the far side, going from China towards Taiwan. In the East China Sea, which is further away from Taiwan, the Chinese forces held live-fire long-distance strikes. These were on simulated targets of key ports and energy facilities. The idea of the Chinese exercises was to ensure that Taiwan is encircled from both the east and the west, ensuring that its critical supply routes are choked off by Chinese warships and aircraft.
中方开展联合演训，是对赖清德当局猖狂谋独挑衅的坚决惩戒，是对台独分裂势力蓄意破坏台海和平的严正警告，是捍卫国家主权、安全和领土完整的负责任之举。任何外部势力无权对此说三道四。
Chinese officials have said that the display of military might was prompted by a speech that President Lai gave on the 13th of March, in which he called China a foreign hostile force. In that speech, President Lai had laid out about 17 measures which he said would combat deepening Chinese subversion on the island and also China's deep-seated espionage inside Taiwan. One of the measures included restoring military tribunals to hear cases against military personnel who are accused of spying.
有现役、退役军人被中国收买、出卖情报，甚至组建武装力量，计划伤害自己的国家和国人。有艺文工作者为了个人事业上的利益，不惜配合北京的指令，说自己的国家不是国家。
Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense countered the Chinese military weaponry that had approached Taiwan on the first day of the exercises. More than 70 sorties by military aircraft, including drones. More than 20 naval ships ranged around the island, including a group that accompanied the aircraft carrier, the Shandong, which was about 200 nautical miles east of Taiwan. None of the Chinese warships or airplanes managed to cross a boundary which is the defense identification zone of around 25 nautical miles around Taiwan. The Chinese Coast Guard also announced that it had sent ships on law enforcement patrolling around two groups of islands that are controlled by Taiwan. Beijing claims Taiwan as its own territory, and officials describe President Lai as an independence separatist. The exercises by China were intended to warn Taiwan of the real risks and the real costs of a blockade. A joint blockade would use China's big weaponry, both airplanes and warships, to stop Taiwan independent separatists from escaping. It would also, more crucially, prevent outside assistance from entering the Taiwan Straits. If Taiwan loses its sea supply lines, then its domestic resources would be exhausted in a matter of weeks, and thereby its social order would descend into chaos. That is China's game plan. But despite Beijing's fiery language and its sizable military display, experts say that these exercises appeared intended only to intimidate Taiwan without actually tipping over into a full-blown confrontation. President Lai and his Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, deny that Taiwan is a part of China. On Tuesday, Chinese media published cartoons which depicted President Lai as a parasitic grub. While Beijing has linked the exercises to what President Lai said in his mid-March speech, China's leaders also appear to be sending a message implicitly to the Trump administration. President Lai has sought to maintain American support for Taiwan during President Trump's term, including by making a promise to raise Taiwan's military spending to more than 3% of its economic output this year, something that would be music to Trump's ears. That has been a big bugbear with Trump, particularly when it comes to America's NATO and European allies. But Trump has not promised to follow the long-held American position of strategic ambiguity when it comes to defending Taiwan. All American presidents, from President Ronald Reagan onwards in the 1980s, have followed this policy of strategic ambiguity. America is not necessarily militarily treaty-bound to defend Taiwan if it is attacked by China. Yes, in spirit maybe, but definitely not in letter. America maintains what is a carefully constructed policy of strategic ambiguity, which is rooted in the Taiwan Relations Act of 1979. The act has a provision which simply mandates American supply of defensive weapons to Taiwan. It requires maintaining the capacity of Taiwan to resist any resort to force by its opponents in case it is to be attacked by China. The Taiwan Relations Act does not legally obligate the United States to intervene militarily. Instead, it simply says that the President of the United States and the U.S. Congress must determine an appropriate response.
Mr. President, you've been very clear in saying that as long as you're president, Iran will never get a nuclear weapon.
That's true.
Is it also your policy that as long as you're president, China will never take Taiwan by force?
I never comment on that. I don't comment on anything because I don't want to ever put myself in that position. And if I said it, I certainly wouldn't be saying it to you. I'd be saying it to other people, maybe people around this table, and very specific people around this table. So I don't want to put myself in that position.
The Chinese exercises come just days after the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was in Tokyo to discuss strengthening military ties with Japan. Hegseth said that the Trump administration will focus on countering Chinese hard power, including its efforts to squeeze Taiwan.
China's rehearsals could potentially always be a rehearsal for an attack. The rehearsals, the exercises, the campaigns we're doing in and around the first island chain are not meant to be the precursor to an attack. We're here to deter. We're here to show strength with our allies, and that includes ensuring that in every possible way American force is projected forward. So we don't want to see a conflict at all.
Still, China may not have an appetite right now for an extended military exercise that could deepen divisions between the Trump administration and China's leader Xi Jinping. Xi is already squaring off with Trump over additional US tariffs on Chinese goods that were imposed last month. Right now, there are 20% tariffs on Chinese goods entering America. China, too, has responded with retaliatory tariffs against American goods. America has also imposed reciprocal tariffs on China, all of which threaten to completely upend the $500 billion trade between Beijing and Washington annually. The official Chinese statements about the latest exercises did not mention the United States directly. China will respond with just enough firmness to make sure that there is an off-ramp for it, which still remains open. Crossing the Taiwan Strait could be perilous for China's forces, even with more options for getting ashore. The United States could send forces to help Taiwan against China, completely upending its strategic ambiguity policy, and that would potentially also raise the risk of war between two nuclear powers. There are reports that Xi Jinping has ordered the People's Liberation Army of China to be able to militarily take over Taiwan by 2027. Xi has not said that China would definitely invade Taiwan, but there is no debate about Beijing's intentions, and now increasingly so, its capabilities. The same cannot be said of Trump's America.
सस्ते वाले 288 votes in favor versus 232 votes in the opposition in the Lok Sabha and 128 votes in favor versus only 95 votes in the opposition in the Rajya Sabha. This is how the Narendra Modi government has been able to pull off a big victory on the Waqf Amendment 2025 bill in the Parliament. 12-hour plus discussions on the both houses of Parliament over consecutive days. Home Minister Amit Shah sitting through the entire discussion to ensure all went by plan. Not only have the NDA partners like the JDU, the TDP, the LJP, the RLD stuck all the way through with the government on this legislation, but even adversaries like the Biju Janata Dal moved towards the NDA while voting in the Rajya Sabha, notching up a big total of 128 MPs in support of the bill in the Rajya Sabha, while the NDA official strength is only 123. The Waqf Amendment Bill is a major ideological project of the BJP. After the abrogation of Article 370, the Ram Temple, the Triple Talaq legislation, the Modi 3.0 has come up with its biggest move so far in its third term and within the first year of Modi 3.0, which is the Waqf Amendment Bill 2025. When Mr. Modi took oath as the Prime Minister on June 9th last year, within 2 months of that, on August 8th, the Modi government introduced the Waqf Amendment Bill inside the Parliament. Literally midnight oil was burned by the government to bring this bill to Parliament within 2 months of its third term. But the government knew, and the BJP especially knew, that its allies like the JDU, the TDP, the LJP, the RLD may have issues with certain provisions of the bill because they have large Muslim vote banks in their respective states. That is the reason that the BJP did the smart move, agreed immediately to a joint parliamentary committee of 31 members giving representation to all its allies as well as the opposition members, and the JPC discussed the Waqf Amendment Bill threadbare for the next 5 months. How it helped the BJP was that the concerns of its 4 major allies, which I said, the JDU, the TDP, the LJP and the RLD, were removed during the JPC because they were able to lay their concerns before the JPC. Their amendments were approved by the JPC, and when the bill was introduced in Parliament this week, all the allies were completely on board and in fact targeting the Congress party, targeting the other opposition parties for blocking what they said was a pro-Muslim legislation which would empower poor Muslims, empower women, empower the Pasmanda Muslims, and essentially work. This act is supposed to work, the government says, for the benefit of the most disempowered people. And the Prime Minister, in his message after the passage of the Waqf Amendment Bill, has also called it a watershed moment, as it will go to help poor Muslims and especially poor Muslim women. The Waqf Amendment Bill will now be notified very soon by the President. It will be signed in by the President next week, and then we will see what government sources are telling us, that the rules of the Waqf Amendment Act will also come in very soon. There will be no inordinate delay, because the government wants to make this law applicable across the country very, very soon. In fact, this could be the crowning achievement of the Modi 3.0 government in its first term. The big moves that the government has made through this Waqf Amendment Act is essentially control the power of the Waqf boards. The Waqf board, which were not inclusive enough to give representation to poor Muslims, Muslim women, where the Waqf tribunal was the last word. If the Waqf board laid claim on any property, you could at most go to a Waqf tribunal and not challenge it further. Now the government has brought in judicial scrutiny. One can go and challenge it before the High Court as well if your land is forcibly or arbitrarily claimed by the Waqf board. Also, this very clear provision which has come.
Viewers, Muhammad Ali Jinnah wanted a nation where Muslims would only live for other Muslims. A nation where Muslims would vote for other Muslims, and that too only those who were committed to the idea of a state where religion was above the constitution. And after sowing the seeds of religious apartheid, Jinnah succeeded in balkanizing India, in partitioning India, viewers. That is why when people in secular India begin to put religion first, we need to be very, very alarmed and extremely quick to expose it. And that's exactly why tonight we are picking up on attacks by Muslim groups. Underline this, viewers, by Muslim groups, attacks by Muslim groups who have been whipped into a frenzy by a cabal of